Hello, this is Susan Valdier. The book I read is called The New Public Health, Health and Self in the Age of Risk by Alan Peterson and Deborah Lepton. A little bit of background. As you probably know, we see messages all the time telling us what we should do in order to be healthy and decrease our risk of disease. And if we know our numbers and understand our risk, we can be more healthy. And this is a very important concept. While avoiding risk in order to stay alive has been a basic human tenet for thousands of years, today's risks are less immediate in nature. For instance, I'm not too worried about a saber-toothed tiger eating me for lunch. Rather, more long-term risks related to health and eliminating these risks in order to prevent disease are the focus of modern-day public health. It's focused on preventing, promoting, and protecting. Preventing disease, promoting health-related behaviors that will decrease the risk of disease, and protecting the public from health threats. So in Peterson and Lipton's book, preventing, promoting, and protecting is considered the major motive of the new public health, and the authors approach the issue from a critical theory perspective. So this theory and this perspective raises questions such as who decides what risks we should decrease in the first place? How are the risks determined? And are there assumptions that go along with these risks? The old public health didn't need to have these types of questions posed. It had a much more straightforward purpose. People were dying. For instance, in 1854, one of the first practitioners of public health, John Snow, used a statistical method called epidemiology to pinpoint the cause of cholera deaths in London neighborhoods. At this time, there was a lot of conjecture about how and why people were dying from this disease. And it was John Snow who used maps, such as the one shown on the right here, to plot the deaths that were occurring in the neighborhoods and pinpoint what these deaths all had in common. If you can see in the map on the right, the dots are where people died. And the X's, which are shown one up in the top left, one in the middle of the red circle, one down in the bottom right, are where water pumps were located, and these water pumps were supplying water to the people in these neighborhoods. And you can see that the center X with the red circle is where most of the deaths occurred. So the old public health was focused on helping to identify the cause of immediate health threats. Answering the questions of Peterson and Lupton in this case are pretty straightforward. Who decides what the risks are? Well, generally we're talking about experts versus lay people, but when people are dying, there's usually agreement from all groups. And in this particular situation, the risk was people dying, and it was pretty obvious. How are the risks determined? Again, in this particular situation, the form of public health risk was contaminated water, which often resulted in a quick death. So again, the risk is pretty obvious, and the solution was not as obvious, but are there assumptions that go along with the risk? When people are dying, the assumption is that it's important to figure out what's happening. So imminent death is worth preventing might be the assumption, but generally most groups agree that that's a worthy cause. Dr. Snow's form of public health is called the old public health. The new public health is still interested in questions related to immediate illness and death, such as foodborne illness outbreaks, for example. But the vast majority of modern public health is related to chronic, long-term disease prevention. And it's described in 1920 by Dr. Winslow, who was talking to a group of medical students about the importance of public health. And he described the new public health, as the science and art of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health through the organized efforts and informed choices of society, organizations, public and private communities, and individuals. So I'd like to go through each of these assumptions that Dr. Winslow made. Let's start with applying Peterson and Lupton's questions to the new public health. And when we compare this to the old public health, the answers are very different. Who decides what risks we should decrease? In this case, it's experts. How are the risks determined? In this case, generally the answer to this question is statistical analysis, which is only accessible to experts. And this statistical analysis is called epidemiology, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Epidemiology is rational and objective. And because of the method for determining risk, epidemiology, there are a number of assumptions that go along with the risks that are identified. And again, we'll talk about those in just a minute. So epidemiology is one of the pieces of science and art that goes into preventing disease. So let's back up just 1 minute and talk about epidemiology. It's a statistical science. It's often used to monitor population health. And I want that word population to stick in your mind. It includes assumptions that derive risk. And the idea is that epidemiology helps identify the risk of a population and the risk that a population will acquire a particular disease, illness, or negative consequence. So because epidemiology is the backbone of the new public health, it's a number of assumptions that are built into public health itself. So again, that concept that epidemiology is applied to a population and not an individual is important because populations are big. So because they're so big, one of the things that epidemiologists like to do is to break down those big populations into smaller groups of people. And to do this, they make a number of assumptions about similarities that might exist within these smaller groups of people. So what do I mean by smaller groups of people? For instance, one of the favorite groupings of epidemiologists is gender, male and female. And the assumption here is that all males are similar and all females are similar, and that males and females are not. Or married people, single people, age, different groups of age, young versus middle age versus old, and race. So epidemiology makes assumptions that within these groups, people are similar, and outside the groups, they are dissimilar, which may or may not be the case. The question raised here by Peterson and Lupton is simply, are these groupings accurate? We talked about the new public health being interested in chronic disease prevention, and we discussed how the identification of disease occurs is limited to experts who have access to epidemiologists. And because of this, they're privileged to make a number of decisions about the direction of public health messages. And Peterson and Lupton raise a number of questions about the motives of these experts. In particular, they're talking about prolonging life and promoting health. And the questions are things like, which diseases are chosen to prevent? How was it decided that prolonging life was important in the first place? Whose idea of health are we promoting? And who decides if we succeed in promoting health in the first place? Finally, who benefits from monitoring my health risk or prolonging my life? And these are all important questions that are common themes in critical theory. Let's look at Dr. Winslow's quote again, and the piece where he discusses the efforts of society. So here, public health is designed to promote health through the organized efforts and informed choices of society and organizations. So society is organized around decreasing the population's health risk, and there are a number of assumptions embedded in this statement. For instance, one assumption is that society accepts this responsibility in the first place. A question might be, who is society here and how did they accept it? The methods used by the society are effective, and how this is determined is again identified by experts. And everyone in society agrees with the methods that are used to decrease the population's health risk. So what questions might Peterson and Lupton ask about these assumptions? As we've mentioned before, who decides what the priorities are? And how exactly are those priorities decided? And who accepts the responsibility for taking action on these priorities? What if the individual in this population or this society doesn't agree with the priorities? What recourse do they have? And a common theme that is always present in critical theory, who benefits from societal cooperation in first identifying these priorities and second, taking action on these priorities? Is it truly the individuals living in the society? Looking at the next piece of Dr. Winslow's comment, we move on to public and private communities. Communities are smaller units of societies, and here communities are sites of health risk. In Peterson and Lupton's view, communities in particular are sites of contamination for air, water, and food. And the assumption here is that communities are unclean and are infringing on nature. The assumption is also that nature is pure. And communities, because they're infringing on this pure nature, are dirty. But of course, Peterson and Lupton ask, is nature entirely pure? And if we were more natural, would we have less health risk? And again, of course, who benefits from the community cooperating with this agenda? Then we come to individuals. So in Peterson and Lupton's perspective, the new public health believes that individuals are global citizens, that they accept the expert-defined risks and their responsibility to prevent these risks, that they're good citizens, they're aware of how human actions impact non-human things. So they're aware of how their human actions impact animals, for instance, or how animals might impact the earth. So we see things, actions like being vegetarian from a moral and ethical perspective, Greenpeace, or recycling, which is very common in communities and a common thing for individuals to do. And they do this because they're global citizens. And Peterson and Lupton would say that the assumptions of the new public health are that individuals who don't agree with these efforts, these choices of society, that these people are not good citizens. So remember, Peterson and Lupton is not necessarily agreeing with the idea that the individual is a global citizen. They're making a comment that the new public health assumes that the individual is willing to be a public citizen and that the individual accepts that expert-defined risk is relevant to them and worth taking action on. So there's an obvious question here. What if the individual doesn't perceive themselves to be at risk? What if they don't agree with the expert? The expert's assessment of the situation or the expert's reason that they should be acting in a particular way. And there's a distinction here. What if they don't see or notice or perceive that they're actually at risk based on this expert's opinion? Or what if they just simply don't agree that a particular risk that's been identified by an expert for the population actually applies to them individually? And does this disagreement in the end really make them a bad citizen? These are basic questions of the imperative of public health, that the individual should act based on expert assumption and take action to be a part of a global community. And if they don't do this, they're a bad citizen. It's a very interesting question to ask. Raised. So the assumptions of the new public health: experts determine risk and population health goals. The risks are identified with epidemiology. It's a population and not an individual identification, but maybe groups: women, men, married people, older people, younger people, black, white, Asian. Maybe those groups that are commonly used have similar characteristics, and they can be used to help identify risk at a little bit more specific level. Society, communities, and individuals work together to improve population health, and good citizens are the ones who are individuals who cooperate with all of the above goals. And of course, Peterson and Lupton would say, what if these risks, these assumptions of risk aren't correct? And what if these assumptions of the individual aren't correct? And I am so happy to say thank you to Ilhan. I don't have to answer these questions because there were a lot that Peterson and Lupton posed that I wasn't able to even begin to wrap my mind around. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.